Welcome to Native Calgarian and Mossy for listening. I'm your host, Michelle Robinson, speaking to you in Mohkinstsis in the Blackfoot Confederacy, home of the Niitsitapi, Tsuut'ina Dene, and the Yiharhi Nakota. I talk about history, current news, unheard news, book clubs, with special guests to give local or national issues a voice through an urban Saatu Dene lens. My life's work will be to honor the voices of my ancestors and next generation with humor, love, and truth. Reconciliation is work, not performance. May we honor all Indigenous voices with that courage. Today is February 8th, 2026. Welcome to Native Calgarian. If you enjoy hearing Indigenous content by the Saatu Dene ADHD woman, my Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you, previous donors, for already showing your support. To those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or questions. Also, giving a review helps whatever medium you're listening from. I have a YouTube channel. I'd love for you to come and subscribe. I actually think that I can make money that way if I look into it a little deeper. So, folks, if you could subscribe to my YouTube channel, that'd be great, because I think TikTok is definitely on the way out, and I'm completely suppressed on the other mediums. So we're kind of at the point now, if you don't listen to the podcast, I know you're not hearing me, that's for sure. So go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcasts and pin posts on social media, and always remember to share the things that you learn to your network. Oki naganago meko cheches tokomaki nara dago de dekots nagotine siku seredi. My name is Red Thunder Woman. My married English name is Michelle Robinson, and I use they them pronouns. My Dene lineage roots me in the land of the Great Bear Lake tribe in Treaty 11 in Delaney. I'm a native to Turtle Island, and my Dene nation is uninvited to this area of Clincho Tine Indahe in Saatu Dene, meaning Many Big Dog Town, named after the Calgary Stampede. I was born in Calgary, or in Blackfoot, Mohkinstsis, as Michelle Elliott, an English colonial name, which has afforded me privilege in an English colonial world. Acknowledging proximity to whiteness is important because the darker the skin, the more racism a person experiences in colonial spaces. My late great-grandfather is Milo B. Wool from Delaney. His daughter Alice is my now late granny. My mother and I are Northern Slavey Dene, or Saatu Dene, but my Indian Act imposed status card by the Canadian government says Yellowknives Dene. Through my father, I am a daughter of the Mayflower and a daughter of the American Revolution. Having a Canadian Indian Act imposed status card is a colonial construct by Canadian policies meant to divide Indigenous peoples' inherent rights. Indigenous Two-Spirit, or the Indigenous 2S LGBTQ community, and Indigenous women are at the bottom of the Canadian socio-economic ladder because of colonial trauma, imposed poverty, racism, gendered violence, and land theft. I am not a social worker nor an elder, nor do I speak on behalf of all Indigenous people, but I share my journey as a Dene mother navigating this colonial, misogynistic, ableist, racist world in 2026. Land Back is a movement that could save the planet from climate change created by colonialism, but it would be a part of a treaty partnership, meaningful reconciliation, and honoring global initiatives like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. As a former geomatics drafter, I'd be happy to teach you more. Go to nativecalgarian.com for more. I think of all of this today, and I hope we honor the many Indigenous lives lost for this British Westminster colonial system named Canada. I hope you see your role in the importance of stopping harm, and as a citizen, see your role in reconciliation and as a treaty partner. My last episode, I spoke about media from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, and I'm sad to say I can tell no one on TikTok watched it. That's for sure. Nobody on TikTok listened to it because, unfortunately, we've seen a huge rise in so-called progressive media getting facts about Indigenous people wrong. And I'm really disappointed. I actually have been really struggling to be online at all. Watching a non-Indigenous people talk about Indigenous issues is breaking my heart. It's making my high blood pressure higher and my anxiety out the roof. because again, it's another example of progressives not amplifying Indigenous voices, but pretending they think they know what they're talking about, and then instead of amplifying us, centering themselves, completely screwing up what it is they're talking about. And I just feel like we're going more and more backwards. And then we have this ultra right group of people spreading misinformations about Indigenous people, and sadly watching progressives be like, yeah. So I blocked a ton of them on Threads, TikTok. I just can't even tolerate the like, well, my I'm literally having anxiety attacks because of the misinformation by non-Indigenous. So this one I'm going to read directly from the National Inquiry on Media and Representation, in hopes that just maybe there will be some, mainstream media and these social media warriors that don't know what they're talking about to shut up. or or give it to the platform to Indigenous people so that we can properly report on whatever it is that we're doing. And to non or to Indigenous content creators and such who have not read the TRC, who have not read the National Inquiry, it's showing. Um, it's showing hard. And I really struggle because I want to encourage new Indigenous content creators, but when they don't know about treaty, the Indian Act, the reports, I struggle amplifying them, especially if they're more engaged in lateral violence than they seem to be about the root issue of lateral violence. So, anyway, with that, I'm just going to start reading. So, again, these reports, free, online, available, been available in my link tree since I made my link tree, been available online since they've been reported 10 years ago. I pray one day, if people cannot read them, they'll at least listen to this podcast or somebody else reading it, in the hopes that maybe, just maybe, it'll sink in. So I'm just going to start reading from the 385, the deeper dive into media and representation. Introduction. What's new about the news? Throughout the testimonies presented before the National Inquiry, witnesses talked about the difficult realities of media representation of their loved ones, as they perceived it as unfair, inaccurate, and distorted. As Chief Commissioner Marion Buhler explained, we have heard from many people across Canada that they have chosen not to participate in the national inquiry because of the way the media has portrayed their family members, their experiences, and others' experiences. We've also heard from participants in this inquiry that they've chosen to testify only in private because they are fearful of how the media will portray them and their family members. Joanne A., who testified in relation to two murdered aunties, explained how media coverage regarding their deaths re-victimized the family, which is what I'm seeing on Threads and on TikTok. I was just a kid at the time, but I remember her. Oh, you know what? This is about to get really ugly. So just trigger warning, if you are not ready to hear details, please just swipe. This might be another podcast for another day for you. But there is a very, these are going to be very hard topics. I mean, watching media and mainstream media and social media right now has been really hard on my heart, because you have like racist Canadians, Americans who don't even think they're racist, saying incredibly horrific racist things. So, if you're not in that headspace today, that's okay. For me, reading this is healing, but this could be very triggering for other people. So, anyway, this testimony, I was a kid at the time, but I remember her bloody, knife-torn clothing being displayed on the news. That image stayed with me since then. It's traumatized me. I will never understood why this was done. What purpose did it serve? None. This was only the beginning of the media circus that began and brought more suffering and pain into an already difficult situation. In this case, this family finally wrote to the media to fight back against the hurtful way their family members were being treated, the sensationalized journalism, and they had an open letter published, but to no noticeable effect. The media treated her other aunts in the murder case the same sensationalistic way for a few years after as well. And that's what I'm seeing in the media right now. I don't need to read gruesome details, and yet that's what's being presented. And what is so gross on TikTok, and I'm just blocking people like crazy, they just regurgitate what they've read, right? They're not real journalists, like other than like a Rachel Gilmore or Erica Eifel. Like they're not real journalists. So they're just saying these terribly gruesome things about these horrible files that are happening, just like in Indian residential schools. Um, the same thing that had happened, and no awareness, no context of how horrific it is. But they are doing it for clicks. They only do it for monetary reasons. And worse, in Canada, you can't get money for it. So it's worse because then they're just perpetuating sensationalistic, sexualized imagery about women and little girls and children. And they don't see the harm in what they're doing because they've never done anti-racism work. They've never cared about oppression dynamics in Canada. They've never worked hard at making a change on that. So it's been very difficult reading non-Indigenous people take any takes on basically any of the local news. I even seen a few non-Indigenous people try to talk about the Nathan Chasinghorse trial, and people don't realize how it's affecting us as natives because we live with this anxiety every day of being unsafe, and they don't understand because they've never taken the time to read the National Inquiry or the TRC or listen to Indigenous voices. They just exploit from us. They just steal our words and then not credit us and amplify, ask questions, learn. No. So it's been really gross for me to see basically everyone associated with talking about the Epstein files re-traumatizing sexual assault victims and murder victims, like family members, because they don't care. They're just doing it for money. They're just like, click on subscribe to me. And I don't do that. I've never done that because that's like horrific. It's not trauma informed. I don't know how many people who think they're trauma informed, who are clearly not trauma informed in any capacity, perpetuating negative stereotypes of Indigenous people, or in the case of the Epstein files, women. Like they still come from a very male centered perspective. So it's been very difficult to hear. So in this case, this family wrote the media, and there was no changes. At the same time, for some families, the counterpart of this, the lack of coverage, is also a painful reality. And I'll say that about this right now, where we have so much overrepresentation, especially from Canadians, talking about how sad they are for Renee Good. Rightfully, I'm with you, but not showing that same amount of horrified, horrific response to Indigenous people who are being murdered by the RCMP, and they don't care. They would, it's easier for them to sit on their pedestal and judge an American for what ICE is doing than it is for a Canadian to realize they are guilty of perpetuating this. And they look just like a Trump supporter to me, even though they think they're progressive. They look like a Trump supporter because they justify what the RCMP do to natives all the time, and they have done it intergenerationally. So they are KKK white supremacists, and they don't even realize they're doing it. It's just so gross. I can't even. I'm debating just unfollowing everybody on the internet because it's just so. It's too much. It's too much to listen to it. So yeah, needless to say, lack of coverage for, real issues in Canada when it comes to these murders by the RCMP on Indigenous people since the beginning of just this year, and Canadians not sharing it, not talking about it, not holding RCMP to the same standard they expect Americans to hold ICE to. Anyway, I'm just going to continue here. Dolores S. shared how she looked to use media to support her quest for justice for her loved one, Nadine, but the process of doing so had led to re-traumatization. I've had to continually go to media and replay the events that happened in her story over and over and over for the last 2 years to get somebody to listen, to get somebody to hear that this is a bigger problem, that these issues are bigger, that this is not just another Indigenous woman, but this is a woman problem that is arising in Canada with our Indigenous women being going missing and murdered. And it is traumatizing. It's so very traumatizing to have to take my family through this over and over and over. For those families, the fact that missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people receive disproportionately less media coverage than their non-Indigenous counterparts is a painful reality. The limited attention to the media to its framing of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people sends the message that Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit are often not newsworthy victims, contributing to the Canadian public's apathy towards this crisis. Bang, bang, bang. This deeper issue summarizes the existing academic literature on the media's representation of Indigenous people and incorporates new knowledge about media's representation gathered from the National Inquiry's truth-gathering process. We outline the historical representations of Indigenous women in Canadian discourse and how this portrayals manifest in today's media and representations of them. We continue to discuss the framing, context, and coverage by traditional and non-traditional forms of media of Indigenous people. This analysis determines how the media represents or representation contributes to and legitimizes the violence towards Indigenous people, suggesting important findings about the way forward for truthful representation in Canadian media of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people. Historical representations of Indigenous women, Queen, Indian Princess, and Squaw. Negative, sexist, and racist representations of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people are part of Canadians' colonial history. Fuck, I swear I posted that on my social medias this week, and nobody gives a shit. Anyway, early representations of Indigenous women in Canada are intimately tied to the process of colonization. Although Indigenous women's connection to the land is used in both Western and Indigenous historical frameworks, the Euro-constructed image of Indigenous women mirrors Western attitudes towards land of control, conquest, possession, and exploitation. North American images of Indigenous women have been constructed within the context of colonization and have evolved as three stereotypes: the Queen, the Indian Princess, and the Squaw. All of these early representations of Indigenous women are overtly sexual and charged with colonist goals and perception of land. When settlers first encountered Indigenous women in the 16th century, they produced images of Indigenous women that encapsulated the beauty of the New World. As scholar Joyce Green explains, representation of Indigenous women as the Queen were exotic, powerful, and dangerous. The Queen was both militant and mothering. Indigenous women are presented as being draped in leaves, feathers, and animal skins, as well as heavy jewelry, and appears aggressive, militant, and armed with spears and arrows. The Queen is also something to be desired and feared. As Europeans aspired to conquer more land, the Queen trope was replaced with that of the Indian princess. Colonists' expansion of North America would only work if the Queen metaphor became more accessible and less powerful. Europeans began producing images of Indigenous women as the Indian princess. The mother goddess representation of Indigenous women was replaced with the more girlish, sexual figure. The Indian princess was easily assimilated into European ideals of womanhood, and that persona cooperated with settlers to colonize Indigenous lands. This imagery of Indigenous women symbolized virgin land was open for consumption to settlers. However, once Indigenous people in North America began to resist colonization, the archetype of Indigenous womanhood changed again. Europeans imposed the squaw stereotype on Indigenous women to legitimize land acquisition, based on the principle that not only civilized people would have to have or develop land, term squaw literally means dirty, immoral, and unworthy. It is the antithesis to a traditional Victorian woman. Portraying Indigenous women as squaws has subsequently legitimized many forms of violence against Indigenous women. For example, the squaw stereotype represents Indigenous women as unfit mothers. Therefore, if Indigenous mothers are portrayed as unfit to raise their children within the confinement of the Victorian family model, the Canadian government can legitimize the forcible removal of Indigenous children by child welfare services. As squaw, Indigenous women are seen to be unable to mother because of issues such as domestic violence and poverty, which fucking Canada imposed. These are targeted policies of marginalization and are the products of Canada's colonial history and live on into the present. The narrative of Indigenous women as easy squaws was also used to describe Indigenous women's sexuality as lewd by government officials, law enforcement, and other colonial authorities. This manifestation of squaw stereotype was and still used to excuse the violence Indigenous women and girls experienced by the white settler men. This narrative of easy Indigenous women was created to cover up white males' unmarried sexual activity. Portraying Indigenous women as squaws allows Indigenous women to be blamed for the sexual deviance of white settler men. However, Janice Acus, professor of Indigenous and English literature at First Nations University, argued that regardless of how Indigenous women are portrayed, either as Indigenous princess or squaw, they are sexualized and deemed accessible to white European men for consumption. Creating and silencing the violence in media framing. I was just complaining about this because there was a horrible tragedy. And, it's when I hear Canadian reporters say, this is the worst thing we've ever seen, it erases the truth of Canada, of what they've done to not just Indigenous people, but Black people as well. Anyway, the historic stereotypes of Indigenous women manifest in today's media representation of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit. They are still subject to representations as the Indian princess or squaw by the media. The representation of Indigenous people in the news is different than that of non-Indigenous counterparts, and it is in context and framing. Context is the information included in a news article. News media framing is broadly understood as the selection of some aspects of information to make them more important. Media frames are also persuasive and analytical tools. They are mental shortcuts that allow complex issues and ideas to be understood. Media frames can explicitly and inexplicitly shape attitudes and opinions based on what is included in the frame and how it's understood. Media representation is not neutral. Power is at the core of what is considered newsworthy. News representation of Indigenous people and of the violence against them are linked in what is deemed worthy or unworthy coverage. Newsworthiness is what makes a story worth telling. However, not all women who experience violence are treated equally by the media. In determining the victims of violence are newsworthy, the news media often represents victims of violence as binary, either good or bad. Like society, the binary that the news media depicts falls along racial and class lines. White, educated, and wealthy women are portrayed as good women who are worth saving and reporting on, whereas Indigenous women are portrayed as bad women who are unworthy. Consequently, the media's binary portrayal of violence against women results in white missing and murdered women being framed as more compassionately than Indigenous missing and murdered women. A case study of news media representation of missing and murdered Indigenous women by researcher Christian Gilchrist compared with the representation of missing and murdered white women highlights the media's unequal representation of victims of violence. All 6 women in the case study were under the age of 30, attended school, or were working. had close connections with family and friends, and had disappeared between the time of 2003 and 2005. None of the women in the case studies were sex workers or had runaways from their families. However, the media highlighted the non-Indigenous women's personalities, families, ambitions, and hobbies. In contrast, the details of Indigenous women's lives were scant. Since the article about Indigenous women were significantly shorter than those in the non-Indigenous women, the media did not convey who these women were and what they meant to their families and communities in the same way they did for non-Indigenous women. Most often, news media emphasize Indigenous women and girls as criminal. Indigenous women are primarily framed as sex workers and criminals, never innocent victims. Street Workers in Canada Media Print, a study of media representation of Indigenous sex workers from 2006 to 2009, found that the two dominant narratives emerge from news media coverage. The first is that it is perpetuated by the media as vermin victim. This narrative portrays Indigenous sex workers as dirty and as a nuisance to Canadian society. Sex work is depicted as something that should be eradicated. The second narrative that emerges from news media representing Indigenous sex workers is that Indigenous women are to blame for the violence against them because they engaged in high-risk lifestyles. The media continually refers to sex work as a lifestyle, suggesting that sex work is an individual choice, despite the fact that many women have no other employment opportunities available to them. Media discourse about sex work as individual choice suggests that Indigenous women who engage in sex work and experience violence as a result are actually at fault by choosing to engage with high-risk lifestyles. Indigenous sex workers must also accept the consequences of that lifestyle. Criminalization portrayals were cited in the testimony before the National Inquiry. Eleonora S. shared with the National Inquiry, "I'm sure a lot of families have this in common, but what media does is how they portray our sisters, our aunties, our daughters. It's not in a very good light. The one that is often portrayed in the news media is not one that we want to have her remembered by at all. That photo has been in all over the newspapers, and that was a mugshot of her, and that's not how we want to remember her." As Jamie Lee Hamilton shared, people are more than that. Their humanity is robbed from them, and you just categorize them by those terms, and there's no need for that. The repetitive high representation of Indigenous women engaging in so-called high-risk lifestyles normalizes the violence against them. In emphasizing Indigenous women's criminal activity in the news and media, there's no attention paid to Canada's colonial history, which constrains and shapes some Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirits experiences and opportunities. News media representation blames Indigenous women and girls for the violence against them and dismisses the unequal social conditions that contribute to the Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples engaging in sex work and or living in poverty. As Jamie Lee Hamilton shared on a panel before the National Inquiry, media coverage as related to us LGBTQ can be challenging for different reasons. When we've had trans people, two-spirited trans who have been murdered, the media routinely and the police disclose to the media that they're trans. So they have no right to do that because it sets in motion this defense that's used, the panic. We call it a homosexual panic defense of, oh, the perpetrator was triggered because of this. When in actual fact, they're hate crimes. There are individuals that go out and target trans folks. As Kim M. shared in relation to the media portrayal of her sister, media needs to be educated on how they report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. They need to be respectful and honorable. When media was trying to post pictures of my sisters, they were not very representative. Pictures, and I actually phoned a number of places that were posting pictures and said, "We are sending you pictures. Use these." Even the way they described my sister, when they first announced that she was murdered, they described her as a sex trade worker. So I phoned them and I said, "How can you? Why are you calling her that?" So media, get your facts straight and treat us with honor and respect. As these examples demonstrate, many media outlets perpetuate a narrative that violence against Indigenous women is a result of individual choices rather than social and structural inequalities. Consequently, The violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people is justified because of the media framing, signaling to Canadian public that violence against them is not important. The silence of violence against Indigenous women and girls is made worse in comparison with the media's compassionate framing of white women. A curious silence. In addition to the negative framing and context of news media representations of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people, they constantly receive disproportionately less media than their non Indigenous counterparts. Media coverage refers to the frequency of media representation. For example, the number of news articles and placement of news stories. In terms of frequency and placement of newspaper articles, there are more articles written about non-Indigenous women than Indigenous women. And these articles appear in more dominant places, a more dominant place in newspapers. On average, missing or murdered white women receive 3 times more coverage than Indigenous women. The comparative case study mentioned earlier found that articles about white women average 1.4 times more words than Indigenous women, and that 37% of the articles about white women appeared on the front page of newspapers, compared to 25% of the articles about Indigenous women. Articles about Indigenous women often appear beside advertisements and soft news. Further, others less significant articles are given more prominent space when being placed near stories of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Poorly placed articles signal to readers that the stories in the article lack urgency and social importance. The placement of news articles about Indigenous women in the periphery of newspapers signals to readers that missing and murdered Indigenous women are not newsworthy. Further, a study conducted in 2008 found that even Indigenous women who do not engage in high-risk lifestyles also receive limited news coverage media. In 2004, Daleen K. Boss, a 25-year-old Cree University student and mother from Onion Lake First Nation, went missing in Saskatoon. There was only a total of 51 articles in the Saskatoon Star Phoenix, a daily newspaper serving the Saskatoon area, and the Regina Leader Post, a daily newspaper received in the Regina area over a 4-year time period about her disappearance and death. During the critical 2-week period when Daleen first went missing, her disappearance received no news coverage, despite the fact that her family notified the police within 24 hours of her disappearance. Once the killer was identified, there was an increase in news coverage. However, the coverage focused on her killer rather than on Daleen. The limited media coverage of Daleen creates and maintains a silenced discourse about her disappearance and murder. The number of timings of newspapers suggesting that Daleen's disappearance and death were not important. Marlou S. shared about a friend's experience with media silence in comparison to non-Indigenous victims. We met this one family where their little girl was chopped up into little pieces and thrown into a river in Manitoba. And it happened at the same time as this little girl in Toronto, a white girl. She was chopped up and put in a suitcase, and they found her on Center Island. And this little girl in Manitoba did not get any news time at all. But the little white girl was. It was all over the world what happened to her, you know. Similarity, Rachel W. testified about the lack of media coverage around her cousin's murder. It seemed like we didn't have any support, even trying to get media like the Interior News or some kind of radio station, somebody to hear us. But our family had to chase after the media to say, hey, wait a minute, you guys have to listen to us because our family members gone missing. And it seemed like it was just dead ends everywhere trying to look for Ramona. Another issue in news media coverage is that stories on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls before 1980 were largely absent. As Tanya Talaga, an Anishinaabe author and journalist, said, in cases that they were being missing in the 50s and 60s and 70s were swept under the rug. There were so many cases of women that disappeared that hardly any information anywhere was on them. It's important we remember those women. Without information about murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls before 1980, the severity of violence against Indigenous women and girls and how media contributes to and silences this violence cannot be fully understood. To help fill in some of the knowledge gaps about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in the news media, Tanya Talaga and a team of journalists at the Toronto Star created a series called Gone. This goal of the series was to investigate the disappearance and deaths of Indigenous women and girls, to tell more honest and truthful stories of the women and create a comprehensive database. As Trudy S. shared, when asked if her sister's story was ever reported on in the media, no, there was nothing. It was just like my sister was invisible and nobody cared about her. I'm the only one that really cared for her. I'm the only one who wants justice for Pauline. I just want to emphasize that it's the Olympics on right now. And I think it's important to mention that when I'm reading this next section that's titled Film, Sports, and Popular Culture. Indigenous women and girls are also often misrepresented in popular culture. In movies, Indigenous women and girls are dehumanized and hypersexualized, and their agency is denied. Erotic images of Indigenous women as the historical stereotype of an Indian princess persists today. So, for example, the Indian princess archetype is manifested in Western representations of Pocahontas. In his analysis of the Disney movie Pocahontas, Jesse Wente, an Anishinaabe man and director of the Indigenous Screen Office, highlighted the over-sexualization of Pocahontas. Wente commented that the Disney movie encapsulates the maturation thinking of Indigenous women are somehow sexually active or mature at a very young age compared to the regular population. Wente highlights the myth that was the movie plants about who Pocahontas was, and that eventually, not given her name, that she had been given as a child when she met John Smith. He continues, the movie Pocahontas is probably the most widely watched piece of entertainment of Indigenous peoples. She is portrayed scantily clad for most of the film, and the disconnect, I think, is both evident and overall in the media, but in particular when it comes to the portrayal of Indigenous women. John Ford's 1956 film, The Searchers, which had a slightly more nuanced portrayal of Indigenous women, is still dehumanizing. Throughout the movie, there are jokes made about Indigenous women's appearances, and they are traded as a commodity in the movie. Further, Wind River, a 2017 film specifically about missing and murdered Indigenous women, denies Indigenous women agency. The Indigenous women in Wind River are portrayed only as rape victims. They are not active in the movie's other narratives. Similarly, in the 2015 Oscar-winning film The Revenant, portrays Indigenous women only as victims of sexual assault and as sex objects. Indigenous women's rape is used as a ploy device as opposed to being central to the story of the telling. Misrepresentation of Indigenous people is also prevalent in sports mascots. Jesse Wente told the National Inquiry of the ongoing use of depictions of Indigenous people in sports mascots as a clear perpetuation of racism. Indigenous people are the only humans that are cast as mascots and as team names. You don't see this actually with other people. They are mostly named after animals. It's important to consider the most of the negative effects and negative purpose of such a misportrayal in media that are dehumanizing of Indigenous people, so that being named mascots suddenly becomes acceptable to the wider population. In fact, you see stories of these teams beginning to tell themselves why they did this. Usually they refer to this as honoring. They say honoring Indigenous people through these names. But again, if you consider what was actually occurring to Indigenous people when these names were created, I would suggest it's a dramatic disconnect, one reinforced by media at the time and ongoing now. And I'm just going to stop reading for a minute just to say this, like, especially people who claim to be allies in Calgary, we have the Reconciliation Action Group for this exact reason. You know, you have the National Inquiry, you have the TRC report talking about better depictions of Indigenous people. But you don't see these people writing to the CBE when they have, the John Diefenbaker High School has the Chiefs as the mascot. And we have tried to engage with CBE. And again, parents are just like, la, 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 judging Americans from their pedestal when it's right there in front of them. And they hate Indigenous voices so much. They're not willing to amplify the Reconciliation Action Group. They're not willing to, amplify mine. They find the native that's okay with it and they use that one as their excuse rather than reports. You don't have to listen to me. I'm just giving you the report. And most Indigenous people won't read these reports because they're traumatizing, they're horrific. And, and understandably, they're in survival mode. I'm in survival mode, and I'm actually debating like quitting everything because I need to move forward. This is not financially sustainable in any capacity. And because I've been experienced nothing but algorithms suppressing my words, I just don't even know what more I can do other than drive myself crazy. And that's not sustainable. So I need to like just get off these social medias and I don't know, find a job somewhere where I'm hidden in society, I guess. So anyway, I'm just going to continue reading. Ugh, Calgary. A new Wild West, social media and representation. I'll bet you this is going to fucking set me off because that's all I see on TikTok. That's all I see on Threads. That's all I see is these terrible depictions, and even by our own people at times, anyway. Although social media can facilitate racist and sexist representation of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, they can also create a platform for Indigenous people to present their voices. Unlike traditional forms of media, social media has no constraints as to what can be published. There is no overarching message that is being controlled by the traditional media sources. In some ways, social media has the potential to mitigate racist and sexist portrayals of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people by allowing Indigenous peoples to contribute to their own stories. For example, the Twitter hashtag MMIW was used by so many Indigenous groups to focus media attention on the stories of the women and the national inquiry, rather than on sexist and racist portrayals of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Missing from the academic literature is specifically of how Two-Spirit people are represented and largely underrepresented in media. Fallon Andy, a media arts justice facilitator in the Native Youth Sexual Health Network and a gender nonconforming Anishinaabe artist who uses they them pronouns, told the National Inquiry about how they use memes and GIFs to bring awareness to the violence against Two-Spirit people. They explain heterosexualism is a sort of main sexual category and very normalized, and you see it everywhere in media. Andy stressed the importance of having culturally specific memes of Indigenous Two-Spirit people. In reference to their memes, Andy said that they often send them to different places and communities, and people will ask them to send them like PDF copies so that they can print and take up and hang it somewhere. It's more like culturally specific. Violence by media representation, misrepresentation, and underrepresentation. Like historical representations of Indigenous women that are legitimately early colonial violence, today's media misrepresentation and underrepresentation of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit can contribute to and legitimize the disproportionate and distressing amount of violence they experience. The limited news coverage of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit send a message that they are not newsworthy victims. The violence committed against them is not important. Media framing of Indigenous women as engaged in activities that increase their risk of violent crimes place the blame on and responsibility on their circumstances rather than the increasing support and advocacy amongst Canadians. I'm just going to stop there for a second and say this, like I have said many times in my TikToks and on my podcasts and in my, typed out posts, Canadians don't care. And what I find is that Canadians come in and go, oh my God, I so do care. I care. So then I'll push them and I'll be like, okay, well, if you care so much, what are you doing about it? Because I know what they're not doing. I know they're not sharing positive information about us. In fact, in this week, watching non-Indigenous share fucking racial tropes just made me want to punch a bunch of them in the face. So blocking is probably for the best, and I'm very proud of me. And continue reading. Misrepresentation and lack of coverage also legitimizes the Canadian government's lack of intervention and inadequate police investigations. Dr. Robin Bourgeois, a Cree professor at Brock University, told the National Inquiry. The hypersexualization of Indigenous women and girls and the perception that we are inherently sexually available, means that violence that happens to our bodies doesn't count. Because, I mean, in really gross kind of pop culture terms, that's actually what we've heard people say, that you're getting what you ask for. We put ourselves in, where our very existence, where we asked for it. So it exonerates that violence and that source of the ideas. It is inherent belief within the settler colonial system, in which is the foundation of the current Canadian nation state, that Indigenous women and girls are inferior, deviant, dysfunctional, and need to be eliminated from this nation state. And that makes it okay to abuse and violate Indigenous women and girls. The underrepresentation and misrepresentation of Indigenous girls, women, and Two-Spirit people allow the Canadian government and the public to maintain its apathy towards ongoing crisis. And that's what I'm trying to call out with people, but I don't think they get it. They just have their white fragility and white narcissism and are like, that's not me, I care. But they're not, their apathy is their action, and they don't see that. So continuing reading. Consequently, the Canadian public's attitude towards Indigenous women heightens the women's vulnerability to violence by non-Indigenous Canadians. Amnesty International's 2004 report, Stolen Sisters, Discrimination and Violence Against Aboriginal Women in Canada, found that non-Indigenous Canadians' violence towards Indigenous women and girls is motivated by racism and sexism. The report also found that non-Indigenous men's violence towards Indigenous women is part motivated by the Canadians' public indifference to the death and disappearance of Indigenous women and girls. The findings in Stolen Sisters are sobering when understood in the context of how media informs Canadian public opinion about murdered and missing women and girls. The 2018 study on Inuit women's responses to various Western media highlights the findings in the Stolen Sisters. We do not kiss like that, Inuit women responded to a music video representation that Indigenous women believed that the media's representation of Indigenous women legitimizes the physical violence against them. The women in the study believed that the media's representation of murdered and missing women as victims of violence focused on their indigeneity rather than the socioeconomic structures causes of violence. One woman stated that the media portrays Indigenous women as illiterate and dumb so that they can easily rape us or sexually abuse us. The amount of times I have felt that way around Canadians. And I run a fucking book club, for Christ's sakes. Anyway, I'm sorry for interrupting. Media representation of Indigenous women and girls perpetuates the ongoing colonial violence against Indigenous women. As we heard, these stereotypes, as well as lack of coverage that crimes of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people receive, mean that some perpetrators feel as if these victims represent less risk to them in committing the violence. In addition, the legitimizing the violence of non-Indigenous perpetuators, some witnesses shared Indigenous men have accepted the media's stereotypes, viewing the victims as people that nobody cares about or believing, and they won't get caught and they won't be persecuted because of that. And I'll just say that I recently was trying to talk about how our Indigenous men are wrongly perpetuated and how, especially white Canadian women, they will follow all of the Indigenous men and have like this sexualized idea of who they are and their spirituality. And it just makes me fucking want to vomit. So I'll say that as well about our poor men. anyway, um, just to continue reading, in the absence of appropriate representation of Indigenous people in media, misrepresentations become the accepted truth. The way that Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people are represented by the media affects how Indigenous people see themselves and their cultures. As scholar Janice Akus explains, stereotypic images of Indian princesses, squaws, drugs, suffering helpless victims, tawny temptress, or loose squaws falsify our reality and suggest in a subliminal way that those stereotype images are indeed Indigenous people. Sandra L. stated, I used to hate my people, like how come we're supposed to be all of these bums, but I didn't know. I thought these people who were telling me about who my people were, I thought that was the truth. It wasn't the truth, right? I know I had to deconstruct that too. I call that internalized racism. They didn't use that term here in the book, but I just want to bring it up because I think it's important to stress, and especially to folks who are unlearning. But I mean, also, I'm saying this because since this was released, 10 years ago, the TRC being released, we have more verbiage to explain this experience in a way that maybe we didn't even then. This is a great report, the way it's written, but it could be written even better, I think, and in today's standards, because I mean, we were still using the word Aboriginal throughout this as well. Um, Anyway, I'm just going to continue talking now. So we're on page 291 or 392. And for folks who are just joining me, remember this is free and available. You shouldn't have to read this to you, but I have to read it because watching non-Indigenous people talk about Indigenous issues or just so glibly talk about the Epstein files or Nathan Chasinghorse trial, I am. I'm triggered. I'm at my 10 out of 10 of anxiety, and I am struggling with engaging in social media and media because of the ignorance of Canadians who are telling on themselves. They haven't read the Indian Act, they haven't read the TRC, they haven't read the National Inquiry every time they speak and post. They're just so gross about it. So, the path forward telling our stories, the truth about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls must be represented in media. Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people have spirit. They are mothers, daughters, sisters, aunties, wives, valued members of community. They matter and their stories are important. The path forward to honest representations of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit is not straight or easy, but there are several changes that the media can make to lead to more truthful representations that can ultimately contribute to change. As Sandra L., a witness before the National Inquiry, said, the thing about learning the truth is that it'll set you free, but it's painful as hell going through the process. A common recommendation in both academic literature and testimonial knowledge is that for fair media representation of Indigenous people must be able to tell their own stories. Indigenous people are the experts in their own lives. Their knowledge must be presented in the media. Connie Grey Eyes, a member of the Big Stone Cree Nation, an advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, told the National Inquiry that it is important for the families of missing and murdered Indigenous women to tell their own stories in their own terms. Quite often, when stories of a woman that has gone missing or has been murdered, there is a stereotype that is attached to it. And for a family to be able to go and tell their story, their truth of their loved one is so important because we are not what the media often portrays us to be. We are mothers, grandmothers, aunties, sisters. We are ceremonial people. You know, we've seen so many stories of my own personal friends in the media that have been disgusted by the way they were portrayed. Laura S., testifying about her loved ones, implored the media to reach out to families. Before you publish anything, I know it's for ratings, or whatever, but reach out to the families because we all will help you. We want to portray the positive image, not just what you guys want to put out there. And I know for our story, it was just, come on, just be a little more sensitive, because the graphic details that they portrayed of my auntie were horrendous. And that's all the public knows about her. No, I'm not going to, that's not what I'm going to share, what was posted, what was said, but it was just dehumanizing. In some cases, that also meant understanding and respecting traditional protocols and traditions of grieving. As Mackay A. shared, her family's silence was interpreted by media as support for the perpetrator. My relatives did not feel it was in their interest to speak on my behalf as the mother of the child and did not want to be interviewed by the media with their questions. At first, I wasn't interested in being interviewed myself, but one of the questions was, are the A family supportive of murder then because you just won't reply? That was one of the questions I was given. In her testimony, Mackay said that she felt pressured to provide an interview, but when she did, she pointed out that the media should respect Inuit culture, whereas you give the person grieving who experiences the loss 3 days prior to contact for interviews or to answer questions. Um, Fallon Anthony, Fallon um, Anti pointed out that one of the ways for Indigenous people to tell their stories Andy, Fallon Andy pointed out that one of the ways for Indigenous peoples to tell their story is through social media because it allows them to represent their realities better. And I'll just say this as a person who shares constantly on all the different social medias, you know, it is beyond disappointing when, again, they just exploit it, non-Indigenous, and make it their own post. And I've seen that, and I'll give you just a great example. There's a podcast that all the white people in Alberta fucking love. And, he and I ran at the same time, but he gets all of the colonial money because he does all the colonial things and is supported by the colonial settler groups. So he'll steal the information from the treaty chiefs instead of just, having people follow the treaty chief's Facebook page. And non-Indigenous, like they eat that up. They much prefer to consume from a non-Indigenous settler, especially because he has a penis, than to follow Indigenous pages, amplify those Indigenous pages. And they sure as fuck ain't gonna listen to me because we've already gone over I'm just a squaw in the eyes of, right? So that's the bias I'm fighting against. And I'm not, I've never really gotten the support by the allies, so-called, out there to perpetuate my podcasts on these issues. No, they'll talk about the white settler and they'll do that instead because that's the way they can only see through a man's voice. Like I got to give a shout out to my daughter who's just taught me how male centered the entire society is. I mean, it's said in so many ways, but I just have to say, like, if you're male centered only, that's why you're missing half of the opinions, let alone an Indigenous woman's point of view, let alone an Indigenous two-spirit or an Indigenous youth, a youth with disability, a woman with disability. Like, I see it all the time on the TikToks, who gets all of the follows and who doesn't. And it breaks my heart that they will follow and amplify a white man who stole an Indigenous press release rather than promote the press release from the Indigenous community so that settlers and the media will actually follow that community instead of they just have to make it their own. They just exploit. Even in media, they exploit. So part of the reason why the violence towards Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people is underrepresented and misrepresented in the media is dominant white settler men. Jesse Wente explains the majority of Indigenous storytelling that occurs or stories about Indigenous people are seen on screens and in media are typically produced by non-Indigenous peoples. The lack of Indigenous representation in Canadian media is problematic because the majority of the information Canadians receive about Indigenous people and issues, or consequently how they form their opinion, is through the media. And in context where Canadians have little knowledge, contact, or personal interaction with the Indigenous communities, media plays an integral role in shaping perceptions of Indigenous peoples. In moving forward, the media should also include Indigenous peoples as part of the creation of stories and storytelling process. This can include, but is not limited to, Indigenous production teams, actors, writers, journalists, and directors. I love Jesse. Thank you, Jesse. Um, in some cases, this is happening. For example, Jeffrey McNeil Seymour, a Two-Spirit assistant professor at Ryerson University and band member of Toquaquilp First Nation, created a video art presentation that recorded two SLGBTQIA people in ceremony. McNeil Seymour described the video in his testimony as a way for there to be more visual documentation of a particular ceremony for Two-Spirit people in my nation of Secpequik to look and be able to hopefully feel a sense of belongingness and attachment, because a lot of us grow up not necessarily having those strong feelings. In addition, work from advocates have resulted in some changes in Manitoba in how Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people are portrayed in the media. A member of the Legislative Assembly, Nahani Fontaine, explained activism from Winnipeg families finally convinced the Winnipeg Police Service and the RCMP to stop using mugshots when releasing photos of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls in Winnipeg, as Fontaine explained in an interview. So, actually, here in Winnipeg, there is a group of predominant Indigenous women from a variety of different organizations that kept lobbying and fighting the Winnipeg Police Service for the RCMP to stop releasing mugshots, because it does intrinsically is when a mugshot is released to the public, it doesn't really induce the public to that particular woman. Right? Because we've got our own, markers in respect of what she's criminalized and what she's doing these things. We actually lobbied for that very hard. And now the Winnipeg Police Service and the RCMP don't do that. Another way forward for truthful representation of Indigenous girls and women and Two-Spirit people in the media is set out by the TRC's Calls to Action 84 Media and Reconciliation, which you can find in my previous podcast. Many of the witnesses for the national inquiry testified about the importance of increasing funding for Indigenous media content. This would facilitate more Indigenous participation in media creation and context, leading to more honest representation of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. Conclusion. This deeper dive has explained how colonial representation of Indigenous women manifests in today's misrepresentation and underrepresentation of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. Today, through media coverage and context, media representation can legitimize violence and contribute to the targeting of Indigenous women by silencing their experiences. As Jesse Wente explained, media should and can be an important outlet for improving outcomes, not making them worse. In responding to the idea that some families were afraid to testify, fearing the media portrayal they might encounter, Wente says that should be a shameful blight, because it is not what journalism should be doing, the exact opposite. Tanya Talaga pointed out that in some cases, these bad experiences work to color Indigenous people's perception of media as a single entity. And that's really hard because, families that have a bad experience and then somebody else hears about it. So it just gets magnified, and not all journalists are bad, but not all journalists are insensitive and have some work to do to be sensitive. So it is difficult when that happens because everybody gets painted with the same brush, and that's not necessarily fair. While witnesses pointed out in many cases the difficulties they face with media, they also offered solutions that point to the media's important role in shaping Canadians' public opinion. While the media so far has contributed to a lack of public concern for the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, that has legitimized the Canadian government's inadequate interventions, it also work on something else entirely. The path forward should include Indigenous people telling their own stories in their own terms for truthful and fair media representation of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit. Findings. The media has not accurately portrayed First Nation, Inuit, and Métis women and girls in general, and 2S LGBTQ people in particular. As a result, the media has perpetuated negative stereotypes of Indigenous peoples. These stereotypes perpetuate racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and misogyny against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people within the broader Canadian population. Media portrayal has resulted in the dehumanization of Indigenous people, which in turn manifests and perpetuates views that Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit are less than non-Indigenous people, and they are not worthy of the same rights and protections as non-Indigenous people, and that they are burdens on society. So with that, I will read to you the actual calls for media. So this is in the second volume on page 187. And so I'll just read from you from the top. Calls for justice for industries, institutions, services, and partnerships. As this report has demonstrated, so much of the violence shared in the truths of those who testified began with the encounter between a person and an institution or a service that could have ultimately contributed to wellness if it had occurred differently. In this section are calls to justice. We identify important industries, institutions, and services that are featured in testimony throughout this report. We include the idea of partnership because so many of these services and institutions operate in partnership with governments at all levels. These calls, therefore, while aimed at service providers, must be interpreted with an insistence on proper resourcing and interjurisdictional cooperation in order to just ensure safety for Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. Calls for media and media influencers. 6.1. We call on all media, news corporations and outlets, and in particular government-funded corporations and outlets, media unions, associations, and guilds, academic institutions teaching journalism or media courses, governments that fund corporation outlets and academic institutions and journalists, reporters, bloggers, film producers, writers, musicians, music producers, and more generally, people working in the entertainment industry to take decolonizing approaches in their work and publications in order to educate all Canadians about Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. More specifically, this includes the following: ensure authentic and appropriate representation of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, inclusive of diverse Indigenous cultural backgrounds, in order to address negative or discriminatory stereotypes. Support Indigenous people sharing their stories and from their perspectives, free of bias, discrimination, and false assumptions in a trauma-informed, culturally sensitive way. Increase the number of Indigenous people in broadcasting, radio, television, and in journalists, reporters, producers, and executive positions in the entertainment industry, included and not limited by provided educational and training opportunities aimed at Indigenous inclusion and providing scholarships and grants aimed at Indigenous inclusion in media, film, and music-related fields of study. Take proactive steps to break down the stereotypes of hypersexualized and demeaning Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, and to end practices that perpetuate myths that Indigenous women are more sexually available and less worthy than non-Indigenous women because of their race and background. Now, of course, it goes on. There's many calls to justice, 231 of them, but those are for the media and social media, for both. And I hope that folks heard what I had to say. I apologize for some of my commentary in the middle of it, but I live this. This is my life. And here we are. Anyway, just real quick, again, the separatists, the way they're speaking about Indigenous issues is hard on my heart. And watching my so-called allies do fucking jack shit about it has really sucked. And worse, misused us. Oh my God, those natives, they're so gonna save Canada. Thank God for our Indigenous people. So it's patronizing, it's pathetic, it's incorrect, and the very people that could be doing more aren't. They don't even know what they're talking about when it comes to treaty. I did want to give a shout out to Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation. They have at least set up a GoFundMe because, as I said in my last one and many podcasts before this, it is so infuriating that Canadians choose to see us as some pet side project that they get to be a part of rather than the infrastructure of their existence. And also that bigger picture that, you know, they could be amplifying so many Indigenous voices and solutions on this. I am reading a report, my last podcast, that's 10 years old. This report, years old. And they just can't. We're just this fun little side quest for them for their ADHD moment, rather than seeing us as the infrastructure of this country. And we have to give our precious tiny resources, barely allocated by the Canadian government, that mainly go to non-Indigenous service workers and their benefits, than actual 634 nations on the ground and all of the urban, friendship centers trying to do the heavy lifting of, perpetual underfunding. And we have to save the goddamn country by our treaty chiefs taking the Alberta government to court. Meanwhile, these non-Indigenous Canadians that claim to be allies can't even be bothered to read the Indian Act, let alone their treaty obligations, let alone amplifying Indigenous voices, let alone reading the things that I just read to you in the last two episodes. So yeah, it's hard watching all of this, and I'll just give a shout out to my book club for tomorrow, because the book that I'm reading that's for tomorrow, it starts off Cora Voyager, a Dene professor from the University of Calgary. This book is so good. She talks about how you have to have meaningfully listened when it comes like actual listen. And we're not even at that point 10 years after the TRC where Canadians can listen to a voice like mine. They still see me as part of those three stereotypes, instead of, you know, a, a person trying to help create a better world for our children and our grandchildren. Oh, I'm getting really upset. It's really hard talking about all of this, knowing how little engagement we're getting from non-Indigenous Canadians. They just want to build their platform and take our stuff, rather than actually help see the bigger picture. Indigenous inclusion matters when talking about Indigenous issues. So anyway, this book really great at, restoring storytelling from an Indigenous perspective. How Canada and the Western world is like, well, the best practices are this and this and this. And, this is really a story about 634 nations saying, well, what works in this nation doesn't work in this nation. And I would just say to non-Indigenous, like, you would not expect the best practices of Calgary to work in Nova Scotia, but you fucking pan-Indigenize us every goddamn day and expect that we're going to all be the exact same. Like, you so trivialize our experiences. Anyway, hope you join the fucking book club. And if you don't want to join, by all means, like, their past podcasts as well. And I hope that allies in Calgary join the Reconciliation Action Group, rather than be on the sidelines and claim that they're friends to Indigenous, when I can tell by the way they speak to me, they are not. Masi Cho to my ancestors, to my granny, to my mom, and what strength looks like through your examples. To my dad for teaching me to be strong and blunt. My stepmom for showing me what a proud culture is through her Austrian family. I want to thank my husband for, he is the producer and he's the editor, and he edits and produces another podcast on recovery. But he's my husband and my childhood friend and father of our child. And he has witnessed decades of racism and sexism that I experienced throwing this mic in front of me. And now ableism, where you get to add that to the list. To our daughter, I am honored that you chose us. You give me daily accountability to be a better and stronger person. I don't feel very strong right now, babe. My hope is my family will be proud one day of us trying to fight this colonial, terrible world. I honor the Blackfoot as the elders and members have been kind to me on my Red Road journey. Elder Red Crane taught me how to pronounce my spirit name, and Leonard Kenny taught me how to pronounce it in Satu Dene. My humblest apologies to all language keepers as I try to learn proper pronunciation. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you, previous donors, for showing your support. If you value listening and can afford to give, thank you. For those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com or you can send in your comments or your questions. You can also go to my YouTube channel where you can subscribe, or you can go to nativecalgarian.com for more. Last thing that I like to talk about is some positive things that have happened. And, I just wanted to point out for the Olympics that, it's kind of a moment of pride for us at the global stage, and with heated rivalry. A lot of people are talking about that as well. And, that if I didn't see little pieces of queer joy or Indigenous joy, for me, watching the kids that are playing hockey who are Indigenous take your glove and your stick and smudge the audience whenever you drive by them. I need you to know you made me happy, but you made Wilton Littlechild happy. I was lucky enough to go to this airport Olympic display that happened, and he was there along with Sharon Ann Firth. She is a Dene skier Olympian. Her and her sister were Olympians for us. And Wilton Littlechild, obviously not just a commissioner, grand chief, but also loves sports, and he's so associated with sports. So you Indigenous youth who are playing hockey, who are playing sports, who are just being the best kids you can be, just know you're all filling our heart. And with that, I'll give side eye to those Calgary rabbits. You're lucky I'm not Tradish. And my beautiful cousin would say, or yeah, be in my dish. Thanks, folks, for listening.